week we're talking about anxiety. When it comes to anxiety, this is something that you have openly admitted to everyone that you do struggle with on occasion. So that's why we're interviewing you, because I think it's very important for you guys to hear from somebody like Shane, who you respect and know that is walking closely with the Lord. He struggles with it too. So I don't think it's a stretch to say that this is something that more and more people seem to be struggling with, especially our younger generation. So obviously, anxiety is not necessarily a new thing that's just developed within the last few years. So why do you think it's such an epidemic for our generation?
Yeah, so it's definitely, like you said, and you know, my greatest area of sin struggle, at least in my adult life. I would venture to say probably my whole life, because even like a big part of my testimony was like growing up, I was very much like a people pleaser, and I would become like very insecure and very lost if I didn't have people's approval. And once I realized I only needed God's approval, it put a lot of that to rest. It's always been a wrestle, and I want to start by calling it what it is, right? Like anxiety, worry, whatever we want to call it, is sin, and Jesus identifies it as that. Even in our passage, he says, do not be anxious, do not worry, 3 times just in Matthew 6, and that should be sufficient, that should be enough, but we even mentioned it last week with lust. The greatest trick of the devil is proving to you that he doesn't exist, that whatever problem you're struggling with isn't really a problem, it's not that big of a deal. And I would always argue the second trick that he uses is convincing you that you are alone. And he's like a lion seeking to devour. That's how he's described in the Bible. And lions tend to prey on the weak, the isolated, the vulnerable. And whenever we don't surround ourselves with community, or whenever we suffer in silence, is when we are most vulnerable to Satan doing what he does best. And he's better at what he does than what we are at what we do. I also want to highlight that like this is not a new problem. Like you said, like we're kind of just becoming more aware of it, I think. Some of like, I think the why is it like such a problem right now or whatever, I think comes from maybe a combination of our own pride and like recency bias. This might be a bad example, but like you even see this with like people's belief on how the pyramids were built. Like we are so prideful that we have the most knowledge on stuff, or that what we're struggling with is the biggest problem in the world right here and right now in 2024, that we can't imagine people thousands or hundreds of years ago dealt with the same thing. I mentioned pyramids because people were like, clearly they weren't advanced enough, aliens had to help them. And like we get so lost in like common sense that we chalk it up to something else. Even Ecclesiastes emphasizes that there's nothing new under the sun, and even like a lot of people have concerns about a lot of things like gender or sexuality or whatever, or racism, you name it. Literally all of that stuff happened and is documented to have happened in Corinth, which is what Corinthians was written to. And it was worse, even in like Sodom and Gomorrah in the Old Testament. The book of Judges has 1,000 examples of like whatever sin you want to highlight, like 100 times worse than it is even today. So like it's not a new thing, and I think it's pretty prideful for us to like act like it is just because we're aware of it now. But I do think like maybe the inflation among like the younger generation right now, and why it's become like seemingly a bigger problem, maybe has a lot to do with just accessibility, and made it like more increasingly difficult to manage it. Like whatever we want has never been more accessible to us. And you always hear like the phrases like we're the most connected generation, but we're the loneliest generation. We're the like the most comfortable generation, but the most depressed generation. And that is the reason we have anxiety, is because what Pastor Kenny emphasized a couple weeks ago in Matthew 6 is because we seek worldly stuff. And I would even emphasize because we build up hevel is the word that the Bible uses. Like that's what the entire book of Ecclesiastes is about. It's like, hey, go ahead, seek after whatever you want the most. For most of us, we're not growing up in poverty, so it's like not a thing that we're holding on to the most, but it's like people's approval. It's having a good reputation. It's having a good work ethic. It's being the wisest person. And literally the writer of Ecclesiastes, credited as the most wise person to ever exist outside of Jesus, literally goes through each of those, and he's like, go ahead, build up like generational wealth. I'll prove to you that in 2-3 generations max, that generational wealth will be gone because they won't take care of it as well as you do. Even be the wisest person. Like a natural catastrophe could happen. You could lose a loved one at a random time. Like, it has nothing to do with wisdom or how you handle it. Rain falls on the just and the unjust is what Jesus would say in Matthew 5. So he's like, make whatever you want your God, build it up. And the word hevel is like described as like a cloud or like a hologram. And it's real, it's there. But as soon as you try to put your weight on it, as soon as you try to wrap your arms around it, it vanishes because there's no substance there. And I think that's why like we want that to satisfy us so much, and when it doesn't, we become more lost, and then we seek something else, and that doesn't work, and just continues to build on itself. And that accessibility to all of those means makes it easier for the anxiety to build.
And just like what you said about like being connected to everyone and everything, and constantly like hearing what's happening across the world, whereas you know, years and years ago, whenever we didn't have the internet, like people didn't know what was going on in China to take that on themselves and be anxious about that, right? And then also just like seeing everyone else's stuff on things like social media, and like to go back to what you were just talking about with like having things, like you're constantly comparing yourself to other people, and or wanting to please other people, kind of like in your testimony. Like, so just having that awareness of like, okay, I have to be mindful of what I post, and posting in this certain way so that people think this about me, and that kind of stuff too.
Yeah,
so.
Social media is definitely one that I meant to like. That's part of the accessibility thing too. It's just like people are, myself included, like we're presenting the best version of ourselves, and even like comparison is the thief of joy, but especially comparison to the best version of somebody is always going to continue to strip you of joy. And that doesn't mean that like social media is evil, but like the way that we take it in can be very easy and make us very vulnerable to anxiety, I think.
Okay, so you highlighted the importance of like not feeling like you are alone, because that's how the devil likes to get us, is to make us feel like we're the only ones struggling with this, and we're the only ones that are going through something, because things like this and like lust, like we talked about last week, can be embarrassing, and so you don't want to let people in and let them know that you're struggling with things like that. So what does the Bible say our response should be?
So I would begin my response to this by like not throwing anybody under the bus, because I would surely be placed in this category a lot. Try to be more mindful, at least like over the past couple of years, on like my response to stuff like this especially, but like a lot of well-meaning people and Christians especially, I think, give really bad advice on how to handle anxiety, and a lot of not just objectively bad, but also like super generic, that like it's just written on a Hobby Lobby pillow or something like that. It's like the let go and let God. Like people use that like facetiously now, but like when I hear people say that like legitimately, I'm like, okay, cool, what does that mean? How do I actually do that? And the thing about like anxiety and stuff like that is like we don't treat any other health this way. Like if my arm is bleeding out, you wouldn't say like just trust God and that'll be okay. You'd be like, no, like use the resources that God has entrusted you with to solve that problem. Like get gauze, like whatever, like get to a doctor, whatever. Man, that's necessary to see and feel. Also, I would say like don't belittle the problem or the person struggling with. Like this is a real problem, and to not address it is to say like I am comfortable living in this sin. So like see it for the problem that is and address it. But if like you're somebody who isn't, like like address that plank in your eye before you address the dot in somebody else's eye. And even like one of the most well-meaning and frustrating things that I hear come from like well-meaning people is like somebody else always has it worse. Like think about the kid across the country in a third world country who's like starving and both their parents die, something terrible, and it's like they have it worse off than you do, so you shouldn't feel anxious or sad or anything like that. And I just like want to emphasize how incredibly unhelpful and un-Christ-like that is, because I mean, Jesus looked at all of our problems and knew that it was little and something that he could address, but it also was not that little because he had to die to like make up for the sin that caused. But he also stepped into it with us. He said, I am not going to just stay comfortable, and even though like this isn't something you should be struggling with, it is, I'm going to step beside you and say, how can I help you? And actually did help. He sacrificed in order to help. So like, yeah, somebody else might have it worse, and that is helpful perspective because the world does not revolve around me, and that is so important to remember. But at the same time, the only person I can be is myself. And although I don't want to be struggling with this, I am. So like you telling me that I shouldn't or that somebody else has it worse, that's not making my problem go away, right? And I'm not advocating for like self-care or whatever. Like there's a lot of like unbiblical like drive towards that. But I do want everybody to hear this. If our goal is to make disciples, which it should be, whatever disciples we inevitably make, like they won't be carbon copies of us, but they will be a lot like us. Like Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ. And that means in a lot of ways, whoever we disciple or have influence on will pick up our quirks, our positive attributes, but also whether we want them to or not will inevitably start with a burden that we have built up. They will be weighed down by something we handed to them. And that's why it's so necessary to address it, because like whether if you love somebody or discipling them or leading them, like they're going to have the problems tenfold because they're starting at the place where we've ended with like, if that makes sense. Yeah. And I guess, sorry, the last thing I would mention is a lot of bad advice has been kind of from both ends of the spectrum on like Sabbathing and resting and like work and like life balance or whatever, because we get so anxious and whatever, and it's like, all right, then I just need to not have any responsibilities. I need to rest. I need to rest too much, really, in like an unbiblical modeled way. And then less things get done that we need to be doing, and that builds up anxiety even more. On the other end, like the no days off mentality is also un-Christ-like, then you can never rest, you never sleep, you're not following the model that God himself gave for us. So it is a difficult balance to strike, and I don't have good advice on how exactly to do that. But don't let that pendulum swing too far either way, because to rest too much is sinful, but also to never rest is just as sinful. There is a reason he told us to Sabbath. God worked hard for those 6 days, and he worked meticulously, and he had creativity, and he worked well, and then he stopped all of that for a day and just enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm. So talking about how people can be so unhelpful and what the Bible does say about it. The Bible says, do not be anxious, do not worry. But what else does it say about dealing with anxiety? That's not just that.
Yeah. Like, yeah, I think I'll mention Wednesday, but I used to hate Philippians 4 because I would read, don't be anxious or whatever. And I'd be like, oh, cool, Paul, like, great idea. I wish I'll just do that. I never thought of that before. But it just takes reading a couple more verses to see, like, what should take that place. whatever is excellent, whatever is praiseworthy, whatever is lovely. Like, think about those things. That's what he's saying. Like, I even use like the potato meme that we've probably seen before. Like, if God can do all this with a potato, and it shows like fries and hash browns and whatever, like, imagine what he can do with you. I've even seen like recently, like, if Bronny's father can get him to the NBA and a whatever $1 million contract, imagine what your father can do for you. But that is true. It's important to keep in mind. Like, think about all that God has done, and that's why he highlights like birds. And he's like, birds are stupid. They're like they don't work or anything, and they can fly. They have food every day, even like a flower, which has a lifespan of like 2 days. It's beautiful. God took time to create it. How much more did he do that for you? But I think the Bible shows us at least 3 things that we highlighted Wednesday. Is 1, fight anxiety. Fight it through the power of the Holy Spirit in you. And I think we see that through modeled in the life of Jacob in Genesis 23, I think. It's a super weird story, right? But you also see Jacob definitely was somebody who wrestled with anxiety. I think a lot. Like, he was insecure. He didn't have the love of his father, and that drove him to a lot of like dark places, and it drove him away from his family. What if this happens? I did this to my brother. What if he hates me now? He had a lot of what ifs going on in his heart and in his mind. But we see this time where he wrestles with God. And he says, I will not let go of you until you bless me. And God's answer is so weird there. He just says, what's your name? And he obviously tells him. And God says, no, your name is Israel, which is significant because he's saying, I am blessing you right now, but I am literally changing your identity to be who I will use to bless the entire world. Mm-hmm. And that was achieved through him fighting whatever was toiling, whatever was struggling with him, and also that he didn't fight it alone. He wrestled with God, mm-hmm. And that's what that like. One of my best friends growing up like struggled with his like security with salvation or whatever, and the conclusion that we came to was the fact that you're wrestling with it is evidence that you are saved. Because if you were not wrestling with it at all, if you gave up, that would be evidence that there is no God because you are alone, if that makes sense. But the second thing I would mention is, know the value that God has created you for and laid like on you. It can be difficult with anxiety because it's like a lot of it's like contagious. Like, we all know people, like myself included, where like you get secondhand anxiety or anxiousness from being around them. And like I said, like it builds. So if I'm discipling somebody, they get it as well. Like, they're stuck with that. But at the same time, as Romans 8 would tell us, like, we are more than conquerors is the language that's used. So we're not just people who have defeated anxiety. We're not just people who have conquered it. We're not just something like that. We are to be pioneers because God has redeemed us. So now our God who is good will take something that was evil, was meant for evil, and use it for good, right? He'll say, hey, what's the easiest person to reach somebody who dealt with drugs before or dealt with a drug problem before? It's somebody who experienced that themselves and knows what they're going through and says, hey, I made this mistake. Let me show you how to navigate around that. So know that God has made you and planned to use whatever you've got. He did not plan for that to happen, but he definitely planned to use you to pioneer, to reach other people. And then, finally follow your good shepherd. Like, every verse in Psalm 23 is life-giving and like should be studied. Every phrase in it should be studied. I always remember, especially lately, like the surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. Because anxiety feels that way. And it's like this picture of like a horror movie where like no matter how far I get away from the bad guy, they're always chasing after me. There's always like this doom and gloom. There's always another deadline. As soon as I get done with one thing, there's another 5 things that are inevitably on the horizon. It's always chasing after you. But our good shepherd promised us when we cling to him, surely goodness and mercy are chasing after us. No matter where we go, no matter what we're dealing with, it is inevitable that we will experience goodness and mercy all the days of our lives and dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Like, what a promise that is. So fight it. Know the value that God has created for and laid on you, and follow your good shepherd.
Okay, anything else that you feel like would be helpful? Nuggets of knowledge or challenges or anything, any tools personally that help you on a more like day-to-day realistic?
Yeah. I would say I did not begin to make progress. Like, we're all unfinished products. I definitely I'm so imperfect at this, but began to make progress once I identified what was my God before God. What was the stuff I was building up? What was my hevel that I was holding on to? And yeah, it was like people's acceptance, people's approval, and stuff like that. Because then you can make progress and investigate why, and investigate like how to not do that and how to replace it with God and His goodness. So investigate why you are feeling anxiety, specifically you, not just like, I'm seeking worldly stuff. What worldly stuff are you seeking? And yeah, I would encourage you to like study what the Bible says about it. Not just like read it, but like read why it was written, like Psalm 23, Philippians 4, Matthew 6. Read why it was written to the people that it was, like what every part means to somebody who's fervently following Christ. There's even like a series on Right Now Media by Matt Chandler that I went through with Segway a few years ago that I highly recommend. Pastor Kenny just went through Psalm 23 a few weeks ago on Sundays, which was incredibly helpful. And don't be easy prey for a lion. Don't be by yourself. I'm not saying like you have to be have like pour out your heart to a stranger. It should be somebody you trust, but it also shouldn't be nobody.
Just say it out loud
Yeah.
to somebody.
Yeah.